Sometimes the simplest, silliest games sink their hooks into me and don't let go, even when bigger, flashier options cry out for my attention. That was what happened with Vampire Survivors, a weird little early access game that blew up on the Steam charts despite looking very much like the hundreds of other tiny pixel art games that come and go every day. What's novel about it is very simple. It's basically a twin-stick shooter that does away with the right stick, so all you have to worry about is positioning yourself. It takes care of firing your ever-escalating collection of weapons at the thousands of increasingly spongy enemies that flood the screen. It's a clever idea that works for a lot longer than I expected before its challenge petered out, and one that feels like it has a lot of room to grow. There's no sugarcoating it, Vampire Survivors doesn't look like much. It's as simple as it can possibly be while managing to stay as readable as it needs to be so that you can mostly tell what's going on in the utter chaos that's about to ensue. The 3 currently available maps are even more rudimentary. There's barely anything on them and they just endlessly scroll forever. You can literally travel in one direction for the entire 30-minute run and never hit a wall, which is odd to wrap your head around and can get annoying when you're trying to keep track of where you left a health pickup you didn't need at the time. Enemies are also basic in their behaviors. Whether they're the bats you see at the beginning of a run, or the mummies, witches, werewolves, and dozens of other monster types that arrive later, about 99% of them just move towards you, with the only distinguishing factor being their speed and how much damage they absorb before they die. They're effectively just heat-seeking projectiles with hit points, and most are little more than fodder. Even the bosses are almost all just enlarged versions of normal enemies with more health. There's not a special ability among them. That last 1% though is more than welcome when it shows up. Vampire Survivors could use a lot more of these enemies with distinctive behaviors, because for most of each run it can get pretty monotonous. When you first start out, Vampire Survivors is extremely tough. I rarely made it past the 10-minute mark in my early runs, and it took quite a few attempts before I made it all the way to being killed by Death himself at 30 minutes. You quickly unlock a healthy collection of fun abilities, and putting together builds of abilities that complement each other is where a lot of the replayability and enjoyment comes from. Seeing so much damage pour out of my character is a satisfying reward for staying alive long enough to get there. The constant struggle is to keep your character's damage output one step ahead of the rising tide of the enemy flood, which increases in intensity based on the ticking clock. You can only do that by maintaining a rapid pace of killing enemies and gathering the XP gems they drop to level up and gain more abilities, and killing bosses to get chests that contain more ability upgrades. If you plan your build and get a little lucky, you can unlock evolved versions that are even more powerful. On top of that, the 11 playable characters each have bonuses that can stack for some builds that get out of control. It's not as full of surprises as the combos in something like The Binding of Isaac, but there's plenty to experiment with. The enthralling joy of Vampire Survivors comes from getting far enough ahead of the curve that your flailing auto attacks kill everything in one hit, turning the bad guys from threats into tasty treats. If you fall behind, on the other hand, it turns into a bullet hell style game of dodging and weaving, while you're desperately hoping for a screen clearing power up to drop and even the odds before your health is drained away. The natural urge is to enter a holding pattern where you just stay in one area and collect all the XP from every enemy you've killed. But then you wouldn't be farming the pickups that award you cash and things like health, flamethrowers, and magnets that draw in every XP gem you left uncollected on the map, so there's some incentive to move around. What eventually drains Vampire Survivors of its challenge is the persistent progression unlocks you can buy between rounds. It lets you boost passive abilities, from damage output to movement speed to giving every weapon an extra projectile. Sure, the more noticeable ones are neat to unlock and then see in action in your next run, but there aren't enough ways to scale up the challenge to compensate for your increased power. Even the third map, which gives enemies an extra 50% on their health, has become easy enough for me to consistently blow through to the end, which takes a bit of the thrill out of it. Even so, I've already gotten over a dozen hours out of it by chasing down all the achievements, and there's already an opt-in public beta where new features are trickling out. I'm more or less done with Vampire Survivors for now, but I'm thinking I'll be back to check out what's changed in a few months. With its dead simple graphics and extremely basic map and enemy design, Vampire Survivors seems like it has no business being as addictive as it is. And yet, I felt compelled to put over a dozen hours into experimenting with its many weapons and ability upgrade combinations, starting round after round to reach the end and unlock all of its characters. The spell of its appeal wears off quickly once the persistent upgrades reduce the level of challenge. But if this is just the start of its early access run, I look forward to seeing more difficulty options and secrets layered on top as it continues to develop. For more, check out our reviews of Windjammers 2 and Nobody Saves the World. And for everything else, stick with IGN.